So in the second part of the class, we're basically going to be talking about this Michael Wilcox article, Marketing, Conquest, and the Vanishing Indian. I want to start out, though, by talking a little bit about Jared Diamond. Now, we read something by Jared Diamond, a very short thing, perhaps the shortest thing, last week, when he was talking about agriculture. Wait, was that this week already? It feels like last week. But anyway, we just read it. It was the worst mistake in the history of the human race. As you know, he basically makes the argument that that worst mistake comes down to agriculture. Oh, no, it was last week. It was Thursday. So the idea behind Diamond's work is, or behind what we read, was that agriculture was, remember, responsible for some of the downfalls, a catastrophe, the worst mistake in the history of the human race. About 10 years later, Diamond came out with a very big and long book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it's his best-selling book. There it is, the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. And in this book, agriculture takes a very, it's not that it's not that the ideas he had from before are totally invalid, but agriculture becomes the idea behind why the European societies came to dominate the world. And what he basically says is that because of their longer history with domesticated animals, they had a kind of a disease, I don't know if you want to call it a disease advantage, but as we talked about, more resistance to the germs, that they were able to develop different kinds of technologies, horseback riding, and especially steel manufacture. And that these were basically what he calls them are geographic accidents. So it isn't that the Europeans were smarter, it's just that they happen to have a longer experience with agriculture because of a happy accident that they were in the Eurasian continent. And so that when these two worlds came together, the Native Americans basically, I guess you would say, lost and were decimated by the Europeans. So that was a book that came out, a big selling book, and tries to explain world history in that way. A few years after that, he came out with another book called Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And in this book, as you can see, he's building upon his Guns, Germs, and Steel, and he says it's the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. This book did not win the Pulitzer Prize, but the last one did, so you can build on your success. In this book, he is talking about indigenous societies, or societies that basically archaeologically, and that in some ways, it's often a tale that they overused their resources. And so they collapsed because of environmental reasons. And he means it as a tale for basically the whole world, that what happened to these ancient societies could happen to us if we continue to overuse our resources. And so a lot of environmentalists have been, over the years, appreciative of this perspective. But I guess I would say that in reference to what we were just talking about, that although he wasn't using these words at the time, the Anthropocene, in Jared Diamond's view, the Anthropocene, this niche construction in which agriculture, state societies, and social stratification go together and have these enormous effects, really did begin 10,000 to 4,000 years ago. And his examples are of societies that basically failed to manage this situation. And so this book was, again, how societies choose to fail or succeed. And most of his examples are from ancient or indigenous societies. Now, Wilcox is an academically trained archaeologist, which you probably got from reading through the article, which is long and complicated. It's got some cool maps and diagrams and stuff, but it's got a lot of sort of academic archaeology. And in some ways, I think Wilcox's article could be summed up as, wait a second, who is this Jared Diamond person? That's what he's saying. An indigenous response to Jared Diamond's guns, germs, and steel and collapse. And why is his view of human history being promoted in many schools and has become a kind of standard for how we tell history? So he's writing this article both as an archaeological contribution, but also to get us to question some of these ideas that have seeped into our society, basically from the enormous success of Jared Diamond in this interpretation of history. And so for me, this article does a couple of things. One, it's kind of our last pure archaeology article that we'll read before we go on Thursday. We're going to start the culture chapter, but it's also for me a transition point between what we were talking about in what we have been talking about in archaeology to think about what then happens before anthropology arises, what happens to those indigenous societies like the Inca, like the people in North America before anthropology ever arrives. So that's what we'll be talking about in the next class. For this class, I want to make 7 points about Wilcox to sort of summarize what I think are his main points or his main ideas. And one of his big things that I think we need to know and understand is one of the things Wilcox is telling us is that contrary to the idea of Diamond and others that believed that simply the Europeans showed up and then all the Native Americans went away, they did not just go away 500 years ago. And part of this, part of the reason part of the evidence for that is that when the United States was expanding into the Southwest, there were the indigenous people to give them sheep and agricultural supplies and all, to furnish the army that was moving in there. They were selling them stuff. So they had been going along for 400 years and doing different things. They were probably under Spanish colonialism for much of that, but they weren't gone. They hadn't just disappeared. Part of this, I think, has to do with how we learn in elementary school the history of the United States. I don't know how it was for you, but at least for my kid, they start off with like a few pages about Native Americans in the Northeast, and they talk about the squash and stuff. And then it's all about the colonies. And you do those 13 colonies, but they never talk about what was going on at the same time off in California. They only talk about that when they talk about the United States expanding westward. But there were things going on at the time of the European, of the English colonies over here on the east. There was also a whole bunch of stuff that was going on in the societies in what is now the Southwest or the west of the United States. So that's one of his points. Oh, by the way, this is a picture from 1900 of Pima Indians. And his kind of second point here, or I'm making it a second point, is that people are still here who identify as Native American. Approximately 4.5 million or 5 million people are thinking of themselves identifying as Native American or indigenous. For those of you who are interested in those canals, there's still canals, there's still agriculture, there's still these kinds of ideas. And Wilcox goes into some of the very sophisticated agricultural techniques that they were using in order to irrigate, in order to not cross-pollinate their fields, in order to deal with the extremes in temperature and the conditions there. And they actually had a sustainable agricultural system. What Wilcox argues here is what broke the system was not that they overused their land. It wasn't environmental destruction. Is that as Anglo or You might say, yeah, well, let's just say Anglo farmers, as white farmers moved into the area, they diverted the water that was running down. And then later on, when people were basically forced out of these areas, they invented this idea that there was a different tribe, the Hohokam, that was there before and then moved away. And so I actually looked on the one of the Arizona websites, and they talk about, oh yeah, there was this Hohokam people who lived here, and then they went away in 1453. They disappeared. It's like, how convenient, how nice it is that you have these people who, you're like, these people came and left before we ever got here. So basically what Wilcox is arguing is that they were, obviously it was a difficult environment to live in. I don't want to say everybody was doing fine or great, but that in some ways they were able to farm and use this land sustainably. There are obviously going to be population ups and downs, but their real problem happened in the 19th century or in the 1850s, when their water supply was diverted upriver and their fields dried up. And they actually also tried very much to fight this in the courts. They went to court and they went to Washington, D.C., but they were unable to prevent this westward expansion. So this leads Wilcox back to criticize or critique Jared Diamond's work. And what Wilcox is basically saying is that this whole idea that it was an accident, or not, accident is the wrong word, that it was simply the fact that European societies had agriculture longer that was what enabled them to conquer the rest of the world, is inaccurate, or it's a false. It's kind of like saying, I couldn't help it. I happened to conquer the world just because we had cows earlier. That's an oversimplification, but the idea is that there were lots of different societies that had agriculture throughout Eurasia and had guns and steel and stuff like that, but that didn't necessarily lead into the conquest and the expansion of the Europeans into the continent of the Americas. So he's critiquing that idea. And then he also kind of is getting upset or critiques the idea of collapse, in the sense that in some ways, when we explain the conquerors, we explain it as, oh, it was an accident. And then when we turn to indigenous societies, those are ones that, in Diamond's words, choose to fail. And so for Wilcox, he's saying, no, we didn't choose to fail. These societies didn't choose to fail. They were forcibly, in many cases, their resources were taken away. There were other reasons for their comings and goings, you might say. So Wilcox wants archaeologists, like we saw with Levin and Schultz, to interact with people who are actually there, to collaborate with Native Americans and people who are actually farming and using the land, and that you'll know better who is related to whom if you actually talk to the people who are there and collaborate with them. And his kind of answer to the guns, germs, and steel idea, he says, nah, it's not guns and germs and steel, it's lawyers, gods, and money. And so that conquest was justified philosophically by the law, by different laws that were put into place. And as I said, the Native Americans did try to challenge some of their laws, but they lost. And then gods, or the justification of religion, and greed, as in wanting to get the resources and the land and the stuff that was there. So for Wilcox, it's a very different issue than simply the indigenous societies collapsing because some sort of ecological overuse of the land that's one of the main things that he's arguing against here. He's instead saying that this was a political conflict. There was ideological issues involved, and that this applies not only to this specific society, but to many instances throughout history, that there's not a sure ecological destiny, especially with many of the technologies that indigenous peoples were using in these areas. And so, interestingly, toward the end of the article, he talks about, again, going back to the idea that Native Americans are still here. He says, assuming that Indians, and here he's using that term for himself, assuming that Indians are still here as I am forced to do. And the reason he says I am forced to do that is because he is himself a Native American archaeologist. And so he is, he says, hey, I'm still here. So if I'm still here, then what we need to explain is how people survive and continue to thrive, and not simply how people conquer each other and are bad to each other. And so for Wilcox, what he's talking about here, and I would agree with him in the sense that the native or indigenous societies and some of these ancient societies, I don't think that was the beginning of the Anthropocene, in the sense that they still had a pretty light touch on the land and a pretty sustainable way of living, which in many cases lasted 300, 400, 500 years. And one of the reasons I think that's true is when you look for these societies archaeologically, it's often difficult to find where they are, like the Maya, for example, which are, again, a famous example of a society that some people say collapsed. Well, there's still 2 million people who identify as Maya and speak Maya languages today, so it's kind of weird to say they failed or they collapsed. But also, when we find their ruins and other things, they're often difficult to find in these forested areas. And so, to me at least, I think that the record of ancient societies is one of basically of sustainability over time, and not of like Wilcox says, of overuse and collapse. But again, I leave that as a relatively open question. Some people do think that these ancient societies embody this idea of the Anthropocene and of niche construction gone awry, and that if we don't heed that lesson, we're all doomed.